Behind the blinding roar of the Roman arena and the glory that gladiators seemed to carry on their shoulders, there was another world, hidden, buried, and deliberately erased. A world Rome never wanted anyone to see. The story of the gladiators has been told 1,000 times. Brutal men, trained to kill, adored by crowds thirsty for violence, warriors who lived and died under the sun of the Colosseum. But what happened after the victory? That was the real secret, the part that never made it into official records, the part Roman writers erased, the part senators banned and the empire tried to bury forever. Because after the combat ended, when blood still ran down the fighters' arms and the echoing cheers of the crowd faded into silence, a second ritual began. A ritual far darker than the fight itself, a ritual reserved only for the victorious and for the women brought to them as part of a tradition hidden deep beneath the amphitheaters of Rome. For centuries, this ritual remained buried under censorship, shame, and political power. Only recently, through fragments of forgotten texts, scratched inscriptions, and obscure chronicles, have we managed to reconstruct what really happened. To understand this ritual, you first need to imagine the emotional and mental world of a gladiator. He wasn't a hero. He was a weapon, shaped by violence, molded by fear, sharpened by trauma. A man accustomed to the smell of blood, the crunch of boons, and the desperate struggle for survival as thousands screamed for more. When he won, his body trembled with adrenaline, his heart thundered, his blood boiled. Victory sent him into a primal state, somewhere between ecstasy and madness. And in that state, according to the lanistas, the trainers, and even the priests of the ludus, the gladiator was spiritually open for the post-combat ritual. But who were the women led toward the victorious fighters? They were prisoners of war, enslaved women purchased in markets, daughters of conquered tribes, young captives taken during Rome's expansion across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Many were sold to the state, others were given to the ludus by generals. To Rome, they were property. To the trainers, they were an essential part of a purification rite meant to seal the gladiator's victory. To the women themselves, they were victims of a nightmare that the empire chose to hide. When the arena finally fell silent, when the gates were shut and the last spectators drifted away, the underground corridors came alive. Slaves scrubbed the blood from the sand. Dead animals were dragged into pits. Wounded fighters were carried back to their cells. But another group, small, discreet, almost invisible, escorted the female captives toward the ritual chamber. The women walked through dim stone corridors, their wrists bound, their eyes wide, their breath trembling. They did not know exactly what awaited them, but they knew it would not be mercy. The ritual chambers, described in the little evidence we have, were always the same. Closed rooms lit by torches, thick stone walls that muffled all sound, a suffocating mix of sweat, smoke, and blood in the air. The gladiator entered still marked by battle, open wounds, dusty skin, muscles trembling with leftover rage. He entered not as a hero, not as an icon of honor, but as a creature still half wild from combat. And there, waiting for him, was the captive woman, the centerpiece of a ritual that Rome spent centuries trying to erase. Romans believed that blood spilled in the arena carried spiritual force. Victory was seen as a moment of absolute power, in which the gladiator came closest to the gods. That state of triumph, they said, needed to be sealed. Lanistas and minor priests insisted that the victor should dominate something living immediately after the duel, to channel the energy of conquest and keep his inner fury alive. The ritual involving the female captives grew out of this twisted belief system. We do not have complete records. Rome destroyed nearly all of them. But the fragments that survive paint a disturbing picture. The ritual involved submission, humiliation, and psychological domination. Nothing like what Hollywood portrays, nothing glamorous, nothing noble. It was the raw expression of Roman power, enacted in its most intimate and terrifying form. The woman had no choice. She was forced to participate as part of the seal of victory, not because it meant anything to the fighter personally, but because it meant everything to the brutal machinery of Roman entertainment. For centuries, historians romanticized gladiators as noble warriors. But the forgotten texts tell a darker truth. Many of them were deeply traumatized, operationalized as instruments of spectacle and ritual violence. The post-victory ritual was simply another component of this system, a way to keep gladiators mentally bound to the cycle of bloodshed, reinforcing their brutality and making them even more valuable in the arena. The women, on the other hand, vanish from the record soon after the ritual. Some were resold, others were reassigned to heavy labor, others disappear entirely. Their absence is just as revealing as any written account. Rome did not just hide the ritual, it hid its consequences. The empire knew how shameful this was. The ludus knew it could never be spoken of outside its walls. And the gladiators, most of them slaves themselves, had no power or permission to speak. When we think of the arena, we imagine only the spectacle, the cheers, the battles, the theatrical violence. But the spectacle was only the surface. The real brutality lived behind the scenes, where the public couldn't see. And that is precisely what makes this story so disturbing. For centuries, it existed only as rumor, whisper, hint. Now, through reinterpretations of archaeological evidence and documents that escaped destruction, we finally begin to understand how deep the darkness ran beneath Rome's greatest entertainment. And the most frightening part is that this wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a system built to turn violence into religion, blood into theater, and human beings into tools.
Yet the true horror of this ritual lies not only in what happened inside those hidden chambers, but in why Rome allowed it. Gladiators, despite their apparent fame, were disposable assets. Their bodies didn't belong to them. Their victories didn't belong to them. Even their rage wasn't theirs to control. Everything about them was engineered, managed carefully by trainers, owners, and the invisible political machinery that fed the arena. The ritual with the captive women wasn't only tolerated, it was designed. A calculated extension of the gladiator system, built to manipulate the psyche of the fighter and maintain the cycle of violence that entertained the Roman masses. Because to fight again, a gladiator had to remain in the same emotional and psychological state that had carried him through the battle. Exhaustion, fear, trauma, these could break a fighter's spirit. But dominance, adrenaline, and the illusion of power could keep him obedient and effective. The ritual served precisely this purpose: to prevent the crash after victory, to sustain the intoxicating high of survival and triumph, and to fuse violence with a twisted sense of reward. Rome understood that a victorious gladiator who felt invincible was more valuable than one who felt merely relieved to still be alive. The women brought into these rituals were never seen as individuals. They were symbols, objects representing the conquered world, tokens used to reaffirm Rome's supremacy and the gladiators' temporary godlike state. The ritual reduced them to instruments in a psychological process they neither chose nor understood. But the fragments left by ancient sources suggest that many of these women knew exactly what awaited them, because some had seen it happen before. Their fear wasn't abstract. Rome's reputation ensured they understood the horror they were being led into. Descriptions carved into the walls of auxiliary chambers near some amphitheaters depict trembling silhouettes and scratched words, desperate pleas for rescue, and short inscriptions that appear to reference female captives who never returned. These carvings, believed to be made by slaves who worked near the ritual areas, indicate that the practice was not a myth, but a recognized, if forbidden, aspect of the gladiatorial world. Some of the markings suggest a sequence, a fixed order of actions that repeated after every major fight. A disturbing choreography meant to reinforce domination and control. But for all the darkness of the ritual itself, perhaps the most unsettling part is how effectively Rome erased it. The empire had perfected the art of crafting its own image. Gladiators were celebrated as icons of strength and honor. The arena was heralded as a place of courage and spectacle. The public saw only what Rome allowed them to see. Behind the curtain, entire lives were destroyed in service of that illusion. And the women taken for the rituals, they were erased not only from history, but from memory itself. This erasure becomes clear when we examine how Roman writers portrayed women captured in war. They appear in records only as property, spoils, assets, numbers. Their individual stories vanish. In some cases, daughters of conquered tribes were given as gifts to commanders. Some were forced into marriage. Many ended up in brothels controlled by the state. But the ones taken to the gladiators after the games, their fates were almost never recorded. A blank space, a silence heavy enough to raise suspicion. That silence speaks louder than any text. Modern archaeologists studying the underground structures of gladiator schools have discovered rooms whose purpose cannot be explained by training alone. Some chambers contain restraining hooks embedded in walls at unusual heights, too low for weapon storage, too high for animals. Others show signs of heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron and airflow patterns that indicate attempts to muffle sound. These architectural clues support what the textual fragments imply, that the ritual was not an accident of culture, but an institution, carefully maintained, strategically hidden. One of the most chilling discoveries came from the excavation of a lesser-known amphitheater near ancient Capua, a city famous for producing some of Rome's most skilled gladiators. Inside a collapsed storage chamber, researchers found pieces of pottery etched with hurried inscriptions believed to be messages from enslaved workers. One fragment reads, "She did not scream after the second door." Another, "The victor claims more than life." And another simply says, "Forgive us." These brief, haunting messages reveal not only what happened, but the guilt of those forced to participate. Slaves had no choice. Refusal meant death. But the fact that they scratched those words into shards of pottery, hoping someone in the future might find them, suggests that even in the darkest corners of Roman society, there were witnesses who wanted the truth to survive. The ritual also served a political function. By allowing gladiators to partake in such acts, lanistas and aristocrats reinforced the idea that the gladiator owed everything to his owner. Victory was not his achievement, it was a privilege granted by the ludus. The ritual, therefore, was not a reward for the fighter, it was a tool to keep him emotionally dependent on the system, ensuring that he would continue to fight, kill, and entertain. Rome excelled at creating cycles of control, cycles that consumed everyone involved. For the women, there was no cycle, only an end. After the ritual, some were sent to labor in quarries or mines, their bodies already broken. Others were sold to brothels where their trauma was exploited again. A few may have been killed immediately after the ritual, though evidence of this is scarce due to Rome's deliberate destruction of incriminating records. What is clear is that the ritual marked them permanently, either through death or through a life of suffering that the empire never bothered to document. And yet, despite Rome's efforts to bury these events, fragments of truth survived. Pieces resurfaced in letters written by early Christian observers who condemned the gladiatorial culture. Others appeared in the writings of moral philosophers who hinted at unspeakable acts committed by victors behind closed doors. Even hostile foreign historians, enemies of Rome, described rumors of post-combat rituals designed to cleanse the victor of mortal impurity. Each fragment alone proves little. Together, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. The closer we look, the more the myth of the noble gladiator collapses. The heroic image crafted by Roman propaganda dissolves, revealing men dehumanized by a system that weaponized their trauma. Their victories were overshadowed by rituals that corrupted their humanity and destroyed the lives of the women forced into them. And now, centuries later, as archaeology and scholarship peel back the layers of curated history, the truth finally emerges. Rome built its glory not on honor or valor, but on blood, silence, and suffering.
As the layers of Roman propaganda peel away, what emerges is not a world of honor, discipline, and noble combat, but a machinery of violence so intricate and calculated that even its participants barely understood the depth of its cruelty. Gladiators were portrayed as champions of strength and courage, yet in truth they lived under conditions of extreme psychological manipulation. Their victories were celebrated publicly, but their humanity was stripped privately. And nowhere was this more evident than in the rituals that followed their triumphs, rituals that used captive women not as people, but as tools of emotional conditioning. The deeper we look into the psychology behind these rituals, the clearer their purpose becomes. The arena was not only a battlefield, it was a furnace designed to produce a very specific type of individual, a man who would kill without hesitation, who would face death repeatedly, who would accept suffering as normal. But after a fight ended, the shock of survival often destabilized the gladiator's mind. The body trembled, the adrenaline receded, the terror of nearly dying echoed silently within him. If left alone, this crash could break a fighter emotionally, leading to rebellion, refusal to fight, or even suicide. The ritual filled this psychological void. It forced the gladiator to channel the chaos of victory into an act of domination, reaffirming his sense of control. For Rome, this was essential. A gladiator who felt powerless was dangerous. A gladiator who felt powerful but controlled was profitable. So the ritual became a mechanism not only of tradition but of psychological survival, a dark equilibrium maintained by exploiting the bodies and lives of women who had no voice in the matter. Some scholars suggest that gladiators themselves were torn between trauma and indoctrination. They didn't choose these rituals, they inherited them. They were slaves, prisoners of Rome, just as the women were. And though they participated in the ritual, many gladiators may have felt ashamed or conflicted after the adrenaline faded. But shame had no place in Rome's amphitheaters. The ludus crushed any sign of hesitation, reminding the fighters that their identities belonged to the empire. In rare documents, whispers of resistance appear. A fragment attributed to a Greek physician who worked in a gladiator school mentions a fighter who refused to participate in the ritual. According to the text, he was punished severely, starved, beaten, and forced into the arena injured as an example. His defiance lasted only days. Rome did not permit cracks in its system. Every part of the gladiator's life, from training to victory to the rituals afterward, was orchestrated to maintain obedience. And then there were the women, whose experiences remained largely invisible to the ancient world. They had no historians to defend them, no poets to romanticize their suffering. They existed in the margins of empire, captured, traded, used, discarded. But when modern scholars began comparing records of slave markets, household inventories, and military reports, a disturbing pattern emerged. A sudden disappearance of female captives in certain regions known for supplying gladiator schools. Groups of women, noted briefly after being taken in battle, vanished from all subsequent records. The simplest explanation often proves to be the truest. These women were consumed by the same machinery that devoured gladiators, thrust into a ritual designed to be forgotten. And forgetting was precisely what Rome excelled at. Roman morality, rigid as it was in public, had a flexible underbelly. Anything that served the empire's power, no matter how brutal, was tolerated as long as it remained unseen. Writers like Seneca and Juvenal, though critical of gladiator culture, avoided mentioning the ritual directly, hinting instead at shadows darker than blood and acts committed by the victor that no light should witness. These cryptic lines, once dismissed as metaphor, now seem almost like coded warnings from men who knew more than they dared to write. Even the architecture of the amphitheaters supports this interpretation.
Passages connected directly to the hypogeum, the underground system beneath the arena, created a labyrinth where prisoners, animals, gladiators, and rituals could be moved without ever crossing paths with the public. Certain chambers had double-door systems designed to silence sound, similar to interrogation rooms used by imperial guards. Others contained drainage grooves that carried fluids away from the walls, suggesting that violent acts occurred there frequently. And yet Rome insisted on maintaining its polished facade. Gladiators were heroes of the people, warriors who fought with honor. The arena was entertainment, nothing more. But every lie grows cracks eventually. And through those cracks, the truth begins to seep out. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from a letter written centuries after the height of gladiatorial combat, penned by an early Christian monk who visited the ruins of a former amphitheater. He described a lingering air of sorrow in the underground chambers, as if the stones themselves held the memory of suffering. The monk wrote of scratching marks on the walls, of symbols carved desperately into stone, and of a sense that the arena had never truly been cleansed of the pain it witnessed. He likely didn't know the exact nature of what happened beneath the sand, but his words match the archaeological findings too perfectly to dismiss. Those chambers were not just storage areas, they were rooms of ritualized domination. It's impossible to reconstruct every detail. Too much evidence was destroyed, either intentionally by Rome or through the erosion of time. But the fragments we have, textual, architectural, and archaeological, form a mosaic that reveals far more than Rome intended. What remains is a picture of a society that weaponized both victory and suffering, a society that demanded entertainment at any cost, a society that normalized rituals we would consider unthinkable today. And yet these rituals were not anomalies, they were integral to the system. Gladiators were shaped into instruments of violence, and the women forced into their rituals became collateral in the empire's obsession with control. Both were victims of the same machine, though in different ways.
As we draw closer to the truth of these rituals, we begin to confront a difficult realization. Rome was not built on marble and glory. It was built on control, on dominance, on the relentless exploitation of human beings whose stories were never meant to survive. And if the gladiators were the visible instruments of Rome's brutality, the women forced into their rituals were the invisible victims, those who suffered in silence, erased from the record, consumed by a system that valued entertainment more than human life. What happened in the aftermath of the gladiatorial games was not a random practice. It was not an indulgence or a side effect of a violent culture. It was a ritual designed with intention to reinforce the victor's aggression, to bind him psychologically to the ludus, and to remind him that every part of his existence, even his triumph, belonged to Rome. The ritual did not celebrate the gladiator, it reprogrammed him. It pulled him deeper into the machinery of the arena, where death and domination were the only currencies that mattered. And for the women forced into these rituals, there was no escape. Their identities were stripped away. Their names disappeared. Their suffering became just another unseen cost of the Roman appetite for spectacle. Their stories survive only in fragments, scratched symbols on stone, brief mentions in obscure texts, archaeological traces found in rooms that were never meant to be uncovered. These women were swallowed by history, and yet their silent presence lingers beneath the ruins of ancient amphitheaters, a haunting reminder of what Rome tried to bury. When historians first began piecing together these fragments, there was resistance. Many could not accept that the gladiators, icons of masculine strength, celebrated in art and legend, could also be participants in such rituals. But this resistance mirrors the very propaganda Rome itself used. The empire understood that myths are powerful, especially those built around heroism. Gladiators, despite being slaves, were transformed into symbols of Roman virtue. To expose the darker aspects of their world would be to crack the facade Rome so carefully constructed.
But history is not obligated to protect myths, and the truth is rarely clean. The truth tells us that gladiators were not heroes, they were survivors. Men trained and forced to kill in front of roaring crowds, shaped by trauma and fear. Men whose victories were celebrated publicly, yet who privately participated in rituals that fractured their humanity. Men who lived short, violent lives under exacting control. And when they entered the ritual chambers beneath the arena, they were not entering as champions. They were entering as products of a system designed to break them as surely as it broke the women forced to stand before them. As modern researchers reconstruct these events, one theme emerges again and again. Rome wanted violence to feel sacred. By framing brutality as ritual, it gave cruelty a spiritual justification. The arena was not just entertainment, it was a stage where Rome displayed its ideology. Strength above weakness, domination above mercy, power above all. The ritual with the captive women fit this ideology perfectly. It symbolized conquest, superiority, and the reinforcement of absolute control. It reduced human beings to symbols of submission in a drama meant to glorify the empire. And perhaps that is why Rome tried so hard to erase these practices from the historical record. Even for a civilization accustomed to blood and death, there were acts that carried a shame too deep to record. The empire knew that these rituals contradicted the image it wanted to project. They revealed a side of Rome that was not grand or heroic, but monstrous. And so the records vanished, burned, hidden, rewritten, but not completely destroyed. Enough fragments escaped the empire's censorship to allow us, centuries later, to reconstruct the truth. The emergence of this truth forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about gladiator culture. Movies and stories paint them as warriors fighting for honor, but the arena was less about honor and more about performance, death choreographed for the masses. And behind this grand performance, rituals were carried out in darkness, shaping the fighters into the instruments Rome needed them to be. But what about the women who endured these rituals? Their suffering has been overshadowed for too long. They deserve recognition. They deserve remembrance. They were victims not only of the gladiators, but of the empire that orchestrated their fate. Their stories remind us that history is not only written by the victors, it is also silenced by them. And breaking that silence is part of understanding the full truth of the past. As we reflect on this hidden history, a question emerges. What does it mean to confront the darkness of a civilization so celebrated for its achievements? Rome built roads, laws, architecture, art. It shaped the Western world. But beneath that grandeur lies a legacy of domination so profound that even today many recoil from acknowledging it. Yet acknowledging it is essential, because a civilization cannot be understood through its triumphs alone. It must be understood through the suffering it inflicted. The gladiator rituals with female captives reveal a Rome that wielded its power not only on the battlefield or in politics, but in the intimate destruction of lives beneath its greatest monuments. And that truth matters. It tells us that greatness and cruelty can coexist. It reminds us that the past is not a simple story of heroes and villains, but a complex web of human experiences, some inspiring, others horrifying. And so, by bringing these forgotten rituals to light, we restore a part of history that Rome hoped would disappear forever. We uncover a truth that lay hidden beneath centuries of sand, stone, and silence. And in doing so, we honor the lives erased by the empire's propaganda. If this story revealed a side of Rome that you never imagined, if it made you rethink what you thought you knew about gladiators, then let your voice be heard. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. Your engagement helps keep these forgotten histories alive. And if you want to continue uncovering the secrets, rituals, and hidden truths of ancient civilizations, make sure you're subscribed. More stories like this are coming, stories buried by time, hidden by empires, and waiting to be told.
because the past is not dead. It echoes. It speaks through ruins, through fragments, through the whispers of those who suffered in silence. And now, at last, we are listening.